What is skill development? Why is it important to understand skill development? And what are some of the steps involved in skill development? These are some of the very important questions that many people ask, especially those of you who are working with quantitative research who do not have any type of skills available and they want to develop some skills. So these questions come very often. What is skill development? Why is it important? Should I do it or should I not do it? Or what are some of the steps involved if I want to go with skill development? So in today's video, I have three very interesting speakers from Macau Institute of Tourism Studies. We have Professor John App, Dr. Ali Bavik, and Dr. Chen Feng Ko. Obviously, I just want to say that this video that you will see today, obviously these speakers were not part of my invitation, but Dr. Ali Bavik was kind enough to provide me the video so that it can be shared with the audience of this channel. The video is coming up next.
Hey, what's up? Faizan here from Research Beast. On this channel, I share different tips and tricks for researchers, different motivational talks, and I also talk to experts about the research methods or anything related to research. So if you're interested in content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel.
To scale or not to scale? That is the question. All right, okay. So the agenda for today, it's about measurement and in particular scale development. So one thing we need to understand is that you cannot manage change. Sorry, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. Okay, I just like to highlight that in this presentation, thanks to one of our team members, Ali, he's going to be using the metaphor of the apple. So you'll see lots of apples in our presentation today. But yeah, measurement is important. For those of you who have attended some of my research seminars before, I've indicated and highlighted that when I started my PhD studies in the very first week, my PhD supervisor, Professor John Crompton, said one thing which I've repeated many times, and that was theory drives research. I've mentioned that a number of times. Second thing that I've not shared with you very often, the second thing that Professor Crompton said to me is that in order to advance knowledge and theory, we need to have good measures. So, in my PhD study, right, I developed something called a theoretical framework based upon social exchange, and also developed a tourism impact scale. And lo and behold, that was the best advice I had ever received, not realizing, some 20 or nearly 30 years plus, the two publications that were based upon that advice have become, very well cited. So measurement is important. And as I've mentioned in the promo, right, what do you do when you review the literature and you wish to arrange to find some measures and you can't find them? And quite often the default is people will try and go into the literature and get something that approximates what you want to do, right? So you beg, borrow, and not necessarily steal, of course. But the thing is that, right, if we borrow and don't adapt, we're doing ourselves a disservice. That's why it's important to have good and accurate measures. Okay, so basically, as mentioned earlier on, what we are presenting is the results of a book chapter that is currently under review. And two of the presenters, Ali and I, in fact, have had our scales published in academic research journals. Okay, so I've highlighted, why we need to measure. So what is the role and importance of measures? right? I'm not too sure. And unfortunately, these days, we don't teach philosophy of science anymore. And I knew in the good old days, this used to be a very important subject. But the whole idea of philosophy of science is, you know, one of the things we look at, what are the origins of knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge? Right? How do you prove something? All right. And basically, if you look at the writings of, you know, some of the German philosophers, you know, they basically say that knowledge is usually gained incrementally. And by increments, we mean that, right, you know, there's no Big Bang theory or, you know, such wonderful finding that Einstein, you know, when he talked about the theory of relativity. Now, we're not talking about those things, but as researchers, right, as we go about doing our research and as we arrange to you know, advance knowledge and make a contribution, you know, we need to understand and recognize this occurs incrementally. So we talk about what is scale development, and in particular, in the presentation, we'll look at what are some of the challenges and implications for tourism and hospitality scholars. Right, so scale development simply is defined as the process of developing a reliable measure of a construct in order to assess an attribute. Right, so that's a pretty good and simple definition, right? And one we need to understand, tourism and hospitality is predominantly a social science field of study. And there's a lot of work that we do in the psychological area. So therefore, this is why scale development and measurement becomes important. Right, before I hand over the presentation, I'd just like to let you know that scale development is complex. It's not something that is easy. It requires a lot of thinking and forethought and reflection. And there are some things that we need to understand in terms of the unique challenges. And these are highlighted by Tay and Jeb. And these challenges are that, right, what we're measuring is generally unobservable, so attitudes and perceptions. Yeah. Where many tourism and hospitality studies base their data collection on. All right, we cannot measure these psychological concepts, terms, variables directly. And we must assess this through indirect means, such as it's self-reported. Right, so typically we forward out a questionnaire, or sometimes if you're undertaking a qualitative study, what we would do is, right, when we conduct an analysis and code the information, all right, it's based upon what, for example, interviewees have shared with you or what respondents have shared with you. Okay, and lastly, the challenge is that it's abstract, and that's the nature of the beast, right? So therefore, we need to understand it is difficult to determine which items adequately represent the construct that you wish to measure and which ones do so reliably. So that ends my introduction. I'll hand it over to Ali. Over to you. Thank you.
Hey guys, if you think you are getting some value out of this video, please do not forget to hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel. I would also appreciate if you can share this video within your social networks or within your networks of people that may need this video. Going back to the video.
I'm going to continue by explaining the scale development procedure. Well, when we check the literature, okay, just a second, please. Okay, when we check the literature, I think the classic scale development guideline provided by Churchill 1979. And of course, there are also other guidelines available in the literature like De Vellis, Thinkin, Nettemeyer. And as you see here, we have 8 steps to develop a scale. However, by using these steps, we can basically summarily we can use 3 steps, and these are item generation, scale development, and structural validity. Regardless of how many steps we follow, whether we use Churchill's guideline or De Velli's guideline, overall we can basically follow 3 steps. And also in our study, we assess 56 scales which are developed in the tourism and hospitality based on these 3 steps. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to explain what should we do in these 3 steps, and I will provide the rules of thumb numbers and also some suggestions. There are some concerns during these steps. And these steps are important for developing scale, but at the same time, when we conduct any study, some of my suggestions might be useful even if you are not developing a scale. Okay, one day at home, you are sitting, you want to measure, and then suddenly a new idea came to your mind. Just like Newton, you want to develop a new scale. And I see that, by the way, I have been also reviewing articles about scale development, and there is I see a common mistake about scale development. Whenever the authors state, they say there is no scale available. Well, this is a kind of wrong approach, because until now, whatever we measure, there has to be something, maybe not directly, but as a substitute, we still measure that construct by using what's available around us. So instead of saying there is no scale available, we need to understand what are the pitfalls of existing scale. And if the existing scales are satisfactory, there is no need inventing the wheel. We can just directly utilize it and we can get our results. And De Vellis basically mentioned that scale development should be a last resort. So that means you really need to measure something in particular. However, the existing scales are not good enough. Okay. And while developing a scale, as I mentioned, we have the first step is the item generation. As you see metaphorically here, we have tiny layers, and these represents our items. So basically, these are the statements. And when we combine the statements, we have the factors. And when we combine the factors, we have our overall construct or the concept. Now, item generation basically starts with the literature review, which means that we need to first, we need to do an extensive review of the literature and outline the definitions of the construct. Let's say you want to develop a scale about hospitality, then you need to check the meanings within the relevant literature. Of course, when we check the literature, in the beginning, we should not limit us within the tourism and hospitality. We can also check management or other relevant fields to grasp the whole notion. And then we should narrow it down and check what's available in the relevant literature. And after we're checking the literature, then there are basically 2 approaches generating the items. The first one is deductive. It's also known as logical partitioning or top-down approach. In this approach, basically what we do is that we check the existing literature, let's say the scale A, B, and C. And based on the meanings of this construct, we can combine these items or factors, putting it together and do our measurement. But of course, while we are doing this, we need to be careful. By the way, when I talk about deductive, relatively it's a short path when we compare with inductive approach, which I'm going to explain very soon. In deductive approach, as I said, it's a shorter path because we use the items and the factors from the existing literature. However, we need to be careful because not every scale is developed in the tourism and hospitality field. Some of the scale may be originally developed in public sector. Then, theoretically, we may assume that our scale is combined and it reflects the reality. But in some cases, if we are not careful, we may end up having a wrong amalgamation of items and factors. For example, in public sector, the industry characteristics are different. And if you get those items, which the scale is developed in public sector, it's going to reflect the public sector characteristics. And as you know, tourism and hospitality has unique characteristics. Basically, Hamilton 2007 has an article and it describes the specific characteristics of hospitality. It also shows how hospitality industry is different from the service industry. Okay, regarding to deductive approach, there are also other issues. I think it's important to put it on the table. Cost. Actually, it's not only for the scale development. In any study we want to start, the cost is important for us because it's going to influence everything what we want to do. And when we use the deductive approach, is the same. We must have access to the available studies. Apart from that, time. As a researcher, I think we all want to choose the scales and the items that not many have items. Let's say if there are two scales in front of us, let's say one has 5 items and the other 15 items, I think most of us would like to go the one that has 5 items because it's going to be easier to measure. But while we are doing this, we need to be careful. It needs to be consistent with the purpose of the study. It should not actually we cannot use the items based on our personal advantage. We need to use based on the purpose of the study. And as I said, of course, a short list of items always useful. Maybe it's clear, but it's, I think, important to consider. Another thing in when we use deductive approach, the empirical formulation of the existing studies. Some of the scales or some of the factors empirically formulated unipolar, for example, communication, or some of them bipolar, like communication and innovation. Now, when we use deductive approach and get it from the literature, if I want to measure communication but use bipolar, then what's going to happen? Am I really going to measure communication? Or I may end up measuring innovation. Or partially, I'm going to measure innovation by assuming that I measure communication. So we need to be, again, careful while we are choosing the items and the factors. Okay, now I'm going to continue with the longer path, which is inductive, and it's also known as bottom-up approach. So we basically use inductive approach when there is a little information, or when there is a little information theoretically. Let's say it's basically when it's a virgin area that we don't know. That's why this part is also exploratory in nature. And what we do, we again check the existing literature, but the aim is not combining the existing literature, but creating something new based on individuals' responses. Having said that, in inductive approach, it is heavily rely on qualitative approach. And you are going to also, I'm also going to mention several validity issues, and one of them is the face validity. It means that when we prepare our items, each statement should appear what it measures. Let's say if you are measuring something about local residents, anyone who reads the statements should understand what's going on, what those items explain. Basically, by the way, compared to other validity types like construct validity, convergent validity, or discriminant validity, face validity is relatively subjective. Because as an individual, we may see it as relevance, but this may not be enough. After I mention also other type of validity, I will also address how can we obtain face validity. Okay, and in our study, as I mentioned that we heavily use qualitative approach. So before we start, possibly one of the concern will be our interviews. Interviews are really important in scale development. One of the importance is that it provides wide range of explanation about the individual's behavior. We get depth understanding of the phenomenon. We can grasp the reality of individuals. And apart from that, when we develop a scale, possibly we are going to also test on some dependent variables. This is like purchasing a car, but you are not going to park it in front of the house. You're going to drive it, right? So that means we are going to test on some variables. And by reminding this, when we, during the interviews, sometimes we may also reveal some contextual factors that may strengthen or weaken the relationship between identified variables and outcome variables. Another issue is that how many interviews should we conduct? 1, 5, 10, 100? When should we stop? When is enough? Well, when we check the literature, there is no universal number how many interviews we should have. However, in the literature, as you can see, excuse me, as you can see, if I take the suggestions of Baker and Edwards, I can collect 12 interviews and that will be satisfactory. Or if I take Adler's suggestions, it will be enough from 5 to 25. Or I think Creswell 2009 goes a bit harsh, suggesting between 30 to 60. Well, of course, it is important to consider these numbers because this is our reference point. But at the same time, we can, these numbers can be also used as a shortcut. By saying that if I take Adler's suggestion, I may collect 5 to 10 interviews and I'm saying, okay, I'm done. Well, that would again may provide an advantage to me, but I might be away from the reality. My results may not really reflect the reality. So we basically we may not stuck with these numbers. We can consider these numbers as a reference point, and we may also focus on another issue, the saturation level. Basically, saturation level represents the moment that your interviews do not produce new ideas. Let's say after you collect 15 interviews, you see that the 16 and the 17 respondents do not give you any new information, and you can tell yourself, okay, I think I should stop because I reach saturation level, because there is no point to hear the same thing over and over again, unless you are dealing with different demographic characteristics. Another issue about the interviews, the interview questions. Okay, we have decided how many people I'm going to approach, but how many questions I should ask? Again, 1 question, 5 questions, 20 questions. This is, of course, a qualitative approach is different from quantitative. We cannot ask several questions. It must be limited. But I think the more important thing is not actually how many questions we are going to ask. Asking the right question is more important. As one Musion stated, asking the right question is more important than having solutions. Because the quantity doesn't mean quality. You may ask 20 questions and get nothing, or you may ask 5 questions and get the true nature of respondents' life. So that is why, again, one more time, I need to emphasize the importance of extensive review of the literature, because we need to check what qualitative questions have been used, and on top of that, we can also generate some of the questions that might be useful. And I want to also add one more thing. As you know, when we use qualitative approach, we use structured and unstructured interview design. In my personal opinion is that it is, of course, practical to start with a structured questions. Let's say you have 10 questions, you go to the field and ask, and it is easy. However, it will be more useful to start with unstructured interviews. Let's say you may approach 4 to 5 people and then see, based on your questions, whether your respondents understand those questions. And afterwards, you can calibrate your questions, and then you can continue with structured interviews. That may also reduce our bias, because when we design the questions, it doesn't mean that the respondent is going to understand those questions, because what those questions mean to us may not be the same for them. So that's basically, again, kind of pre-test of our qualitative questions. Okay. And of course, another thing is, who are we going to ask these questions? Not everyone is eligible. We need to find people that we can get the answers about the construct. Well, whoever eligible to answer our questions, call the population. Basically, as I said, anyone who is eligible to answer our questions, call the population. But of course, unlike government, we cannot reach everyone in this population. And therefore, we need to select a sample, a small number of group that represents the general population characteristics. And this should be representative. Okay. And to increase our representativeness, let's assume that our scale is about hospitality. So I need to collect data from different organizations. So we need to collect data not only from the bottom line employees, but also different hierarchical positions, because not everything is about bottom line employees. Maybe supervisors perceive the same construct in a different way. Their experiences might be different. Maybe managers also see the same thing and interpret in a different way. Similarly, we need to also include different demographic characteristics. We should not only ask females, but also males. We should not only ask high educated people, but also low educated people. We should not only ask rich, but also poor. Basically, as I said, the sample we choose should reflect the population, general characteristics of the population. Apart from that, we should also generate our sample based on different geographical regions. Let's say if you want to develop a scale in mainland China, then ideally we need to collect data from different provinces. And in some cases, we may need to collect data from different countries to increase the generalizability. Otherwise, the developed scale may heavily represent the country's origin. Some of the information might be absent. But of course, even if you collect data from different geographical regions, it's never guaranteed, by the way, but there is always potential. Another issue is sample selection using students. And I think this is something common for all of us, especially as scholars. Students are always around us, under our nose, and it is really preferable when we need to collect data. But again, we need to be careful when we develop a scale. In some cases, including students might be really useful. Let's say I want to develop a scale about residents' perception. In this case, selecting students might be even useful because students actually representing one of the portion of the society. So having their thoughts will definitely contribute to our scale. But how about if I develop a scale in another concept, let's say in the hospitality, particularly I want to understand what's going on in the hotels. Not every student works in the hotels. They are learning the theory, but they have no experience in the practice, no experience in the field. In this case, if we merely rely on students' expertise, we may end up getting the surface idea and we may miss the core concept if we only rely on students. So again, consequently, using or including students in the scale development, it's not wrong, but again, it must be consistent with the purpose of the study. Okay, now I'm going to continue with the validity and reliability. Well, basically, validity means, are you really measuring what you want to measure? And reliability means, are you doing this repetitively? Let's assume that we go to a bar, we want to play a dart, and you see me shooting, and then you see that in my shoots, when I shoot, it always goes to different places on the target. Can you say that I'm successful? I don't think so. And the scale development is really similar playing dart. In this case, my results will be unreliable and invalid. But also, if you see that sometimes I am hitting the bullseye, in this case, you can say, okay, my results are valid, but not reliable. Or I start hitting the same place, but I am away from the center. This shows that I am having reliable results, but not valid. That means when I use my questionnaire, when I use my scale, I am having consistent results, but I am not really measuring what I want to measure. So overall, that means when we use our scale, the answers should not be valid. We should measure, let's say you develop a scale about organizational culture. That means the items and the factors you generate should measure organizational culture. And when you use your scale repeatedly, you should have similar response. Otherwise, it will not be valid or reliable. Okay, let's continue. Okay, another issue is the content validity. All right, similar to face validity, when content validity is also important, but the difference here is that when we use face validity, as I say, it is the face of the items. Basically, when you read the items, whether it reflects the construct from the face. Let's say when you look at me, what you see should be, let's say I'm saying I'm a man, then you should see a man face. Okay, the same thing for the face validity. In content validity, however, it is not only about how it looks, but not all statements are always correct in every cases. So how are we going to know the items we generate that reflects each time we use it? In this case, we need to use expert panel and judges. So that means after we generate these items, we finish our interviews, we generate our statements, we need to ask people from the field, or based on the purpose of the study, we need to find experts in that concept so they can help us, and we can again calibrate our statements based on their comments. And when we check the literature, again, there is no consensus and there is no universal number how many expert panel and or judges we should include to our study. But overall, the literature suggested as many as possible. So it means that based on your budget, based on your personal networking, you should try to reach as many as possible. Okay, and if we do this, now it's time to collect data quantitatively. So after we generate those items, we want to see whether it's working. Now we are going to start driving our car. And of course, to do this, we need a small sample. We need to test our items and factors together. And while doing this, we need to be careful because as a human being, we are all biased. Especially, we need to be careful about social desirability response bias. It can be social desirability response bias known as answering the questions based on cultural norms, or when you distribute your questionnaire, sometimes respondents may not understand those statements. And when they don't understand, they tend to give the ideal answer rather than the actual answer. Let's say I read the question number 1, and then I give 5. And then you end up, and then when you check your questionnaire, you see that 5, 5, 5, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, it goes this way, and then you just put on a side because it's useless. So what can we do to minimize this? One way of reducing the social desirability response bias is placing the demographic information at the end of the questionnaire. Suppose that one of the researchers approaches you and the first question you see, where you work and how much you earn. And then you may wonder, okay, what's next? This may basically scare the respondents. And it's better to keep these questions at the end of the questionnaire. Another way of reducing the social desirability response bias is that using negatively worded items. Sometimes instead of using positive statements, we can use negative statements to see whether they are going to answer the same way. And we will be also identify whether they read through carefully. Because if they put all 4, 4, 5, 5, then it means they didn't carefully read the statements. Okay, after addressing this issue, and again now, the sample size. For the pilot study, how many questionnaire I need to collect? Just like the qualitative part, we are in the darkness. We don't know how many. But the literature suggests some reference points again. For example, Develis suggests minimum 50 participants, and Hinkin, 1998, suggests 150. Yes, Hinkin is a bit harsh in this case. Again, of course, we can take these numbers as a reference point, and based on our budget and resources, we can aim, my personal opinion is that we should aim more than 100. Because when we use SPSS, in order to have significant results, we need enough number of predictions. Because let's say we meet somewhere and you ask, what's your name? Ali. Okay, what can you tell about by asking my name? With this limited information, what can you predict about me? That's why we need more respondents to increase our predictions. Okay, the second step, we only finished the first step. Yeah. In the second step, now we need to see the way we generate the items and the factors are the same. We basically compare whether the respondents also categorize the same way when they answer it. So we do this to understand whether the constructs or whether the factors are unidimensional or multidimensional. It can be 2 or more factors we may identify. And of course, to do this, we need to use item reduction methods. There are several types of item reduction techniques, but I think I'm going to mention the most popular ones. One of them is principal component analysis. and the other one is exploratory factor analysis. I think most of us are familiar with the second one, but it's also PCA also used commonly. The main difference between these two, basically principal component analysis is more popular when we have a large number of sample. Well, in social sciences, we don't have always large sample. But let's say if you are conducting a research in biology, let's say you have a research about human DNA. The sample you use contains thousands of information. In this case, you may use principal component analysis to create different clusters. And in social sciences, we use both, but during the scale development, we may use exploratory factor analysis. Okay, the other issue is the factor loading. Just like the apple seeds, here it represents each item we have. So now let's consider, let's say we have 30 items and respondents answering these items. And what we expect that based on our categorization, the answers, some of the items should correlate together. Some of the items should move together. Let's say in factor 1, let's say we have 5 items, then those 5 items should move together. If our respondents answer as 4 or 5, it must be consistent. Let's say if some says 4 and 5 and the rest says 1 and 2, then it doesn't make sense. And that is why factor loadings are important to consider. Another issue regarding to factor analysis is that our rotation, which rotation we are going to use. This is actually kind of, we are now getting deeper, and I'm not going to go in detail in this one. And maybe Professor App is going to make some comment on this one. In our research, of course, possibly we are using different statistical softwares, and if you are using SPSS intensively, the rotation technique is already available on the menu, and it's easy to click on it. And we have orthogonal and oblique technique. The difference between in these two rotation is that in orthogonal, when we use Varimax rotation, we assume that factors are not correlated. But when we use oblique, like Promax, we assume that factors may be correlated. So we may choose we may choose rotation type based on the purpose of our study. And as you can see, Baldanos also suggests that given that scale development is an exploratory in nature, it might be useful using both and compare these results and whether they are consistent, or when we use different rotation, what kind of results we have. We can compare these results not for the advantage of for the scale, but to see whether any discrepancies. Okay. And now it's time for collecting data one more time. This time, after we test these issues, after we confirm, then we collect data one more time, but at least one more time. We can also collect data a couple times. By the way, when we conduct the main study, we have validity issues. In order not to be repetitive, when I mention the following validity issues, we need to also have it in the pilot study as well. Okay, now for the sample size, again, is important for the main study. In pilot study, the minimum was 50, but in the main study, since we are going to use SEM, and I should also remind that for robust results, we must have more than 200 cases. And in some cases, some researchers actually suggest 250. for the main study. But again, this is also related to our budget and resources. Okay. Now, the third step, structural validity. Well, in this case, we are going to measure, we are going to do more statistical analysis, and the whole idea is having less than 0.05. Yes. And of course, first, when we collect our data, it may not be perfect. As I mentioned, maybe some of the respondents have social desirability response bias. So how are we going to know that how are we going to know that the data is distributed normally? By the way, when I'm going to talk about normality test, but it is also known as non-normality. But no matter what, whether we call it normality or non-normality, the aim here is to identify whether we have any outlier cases. Yes, in this case, whether we have a rotten apple in our sample. Okay, and for the rules of thumb, we consider two numbers. The skewness should be less than 2, and the kurtosis should be less than 3 for the rules of thumb. Okay. There are still more things to say, so I'm going to move on. Another thing is, how are we going to know that we have collected enough number of samples? So that means we need to check the sampling adequacy. To do that, we consider two numbers. One of them is Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin measure, and the second one is Bartlett's test of sphericity. Basically, when we use Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin measure, also known as KMO, we check whether our data is suited for factor analysis. That means, is my data ready for the other analysis? And also when we consider Bartlett's test of sphericity, whether the variance are equal for all samples. In this case, KMO number should be higher than 0.60, and Bartlett test of sphericity should be less than 0.5, 0.50. Okay. Okay, and then of course, we need to check the unidimensionality. This means this is about the intercorrelation of the items and the factors. Together, those items should have a meaning, and those factors should have meaning also together. To test the unidimensionality, we consider reliability scores, or it also known as internal consistency. So basically here, we check two things. First, internal reliability of each factor. Let's say you have 5 items, whether those 5 items are meaningful together. And the other thing, let's assume that we have 6 factors, and those 6 factors, whether those 6 factors are meaningful together. Let's say you have in total 30 items, whether those 30 items are meaningful together, and we basically consider overall reliability score. And in any case, it should be more than 0.70. Okay. And of course, there are more things to justify. We also need to check the total variance explained. This is basically, we basically consider the eigenvalues. Let's say we have five factors, but it doesn't mean that every factor is equivalently important. Some of the factors will be more important than the others for the respondents. And this basically gives us the percentage variance for each factor. And when we combine all these factors together, it also gives us the total, just a second, please. Yes, total percentage of variance explained. And as a rule of thumb, it should be more than 50%. So that means the total eigenvalues for each factor should be greater than 50%. Then we can say that our our scale has also, our scale is also valid. Okay, of course, we have also convergent validity. Basically, regarding to convergent validity, when we develop a scale, as I mentioned, let's assume we have 5 factors. Not only we expect correlation among these factors, when we test on dependent variables, we also expect meaningful correlations. Let's assume that one of my factors measure cohesiveness. And cohesiveness should not only have positive relationship with other construct within the scale, but let's say I want to test it on employees' performance. Theoretically, we should also find positive relationship between these 2 factors. And if we have this, when you test your scale on different variables, then we must also find this relationship. And to confirm this, we consider average variance extracted. And again, this should be also higher than 0.50. Almost there. Okay, another issue is the discriminant validity. When we develop our items and factors, of course, based on the theory, we want to see that they must be coherent. They must look alike. Like each factor should be similar to each other. But if they are too similar each other, it means that when respondents answer these questions, they cannot differentiate. They cannot differentiate, let's say, what is cohesiveness and teamwork. That means those statements are overlapping too much. And therefore, we want them to be discriminant. We want them to be different. So each factors we develop should be similar, but at the same time, it should be distinct from each other. So statistically speaking, the estimated confidence interval, whether it's positive or negative, should not be greater than 0.85. So that we can say that these factors are not the same, they are different, but they are coherent. And of course, external validity. After we develop our scale, it should reflect the reality of life. So just like when you have the apple and when you squeeze it, you must have apple juice, not orange juice, right? Okay, so we can also confirm external validity. And here we need to consider construct and discriminant validity. When we use inductive method, the scale we developed should be similar to previously developed scale, but at the same time, it must be unique and it must reflect the reality. Just like when you use apple and when you have a vinegar or when you use apple cider, when you open the bottle, it should smell like apple. It should taste like apple. And the scale you develop should be the same. When you develop a scale in a particular topic, when you read the items, it should give you the notion. When you check those items together, it must give you the notion, it must reflect the identified factor. And to confirm the construct and discriminant validity, we basically rely on RMSEA, CFI, and NFI numbers. And as you know, RMSEA should be lower than 0.08, and that's the moment of truth when you click OK. Then if it's less than that, yes, now you confirm statistically. Must be so happy. And for the comparative fit index and norm fit index should be higher than 0.90. Okay, this was the summary of scale development process.
Look at what are some of the key takeaways of our presentation, right? As I mentioned in the introduction, yes, it's important to be able to measure because it's only through measurement can we advance knowledge in our field. So there is no the best scale, right? But in terms of what we've shared with you, we'd like you to indicate, well, if you're going to have to measure something and develop a scale, here are some of the ways to ensure that you get a valid and reliable scales. And you don't have to relate this specifically only to developing multi-item scales. If there is some variable or concept that you want to measure, the important thing for you is to say, right, how do I obtain validity and reliability of the measure? And it may be just, two questions that you may simply ask. And if you look at the example, when we describe and try and measure loyalty, right? There are basically, a few basic measures. It's about repeat purchase or visitation. It's about recommendation, word of mouth, etc. So it doesn't have to be sophisticated, right? And what we've shared with you is a fair bit of sophistication, but at least hopefully you get some idea of, what are the principles behind, developing good and reliable measures. Right, so what's next? Certainly there is a challenge and responsibility for us as tourism and research scholars to develop our own measures, right? Don't beg or borrow from others. And as I think Dr. Ali mentioned, context is important. Hence, it's important, right, to undertake some, in-depth interviews to understand the context. When I was sent away to conduct my interviews, I went to 4 communities in Texas. Interviewed about 7 to 8 people in each of these 4 different communities. And in doing so, plus looking at the literature for the scale that I developed, I had 147 items. Eventually they were narrowed down to 47 items, which went into the main survey. My sample size in 3 communities was nearly 1,990 plus. And after the scale purification and stuff like that, I ended up with 27 items. It's a huge task. It's challenging. It's time consuming. But if you want to produce quality work, it's going to take time, right? We need to be, second takeaway, we need to be creative and innovative. As I said, don't beg or borrow from others, right? Tourism and hospitality have certain unique characteristics. Yes, we're very much involved in the service area, right? Look at things that we can do, and it's quite interesting. And I didn't realise when Andy gave his presentation, in the first 10 years of scale development, there are only 2, one of which included mine. Then the following decade, only 3. And then in the third decade, 51. So something's happening, which is good, right? Academics are realizing now that, right, we need to look at developing, good measures. And again, interesting to find out many of these more recent studies have emanated from Taiwan. Right? So things look promising, right? And as I say to you, as you undertake your research and develop good measures, this is the challenge that you have before you. I mean, I'm in the twilight of my career. Many of you are at the beginning of your career. Right? So the world is an